Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm Renata Bichir, a professor here at the University of São Paulo and also a researcher from the Center for Metropolitan Studies. Today, we are really, really glad to receive here my friend and a really important urban sociologist, Talia Blokland. She's a professor at the Humboldt University in Germany, Berlin, and also a senior fellow here at the Messila Center at SEBRAP. And this afternoon, we will have this really interesting talk she will give us on this topic. It's a really long title, but it's a really interesting topic. The normative normalization of urban inequality in Berlin, Germany, teaching and policing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Talia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Muito obrigada para a introdução e obrigada que eu posso apresentar a minha pesquisa hoje aqui. É um prazer e desculpa que não posso falar português, mas quando a gente vai discutir e fala muito de viajar, eu posso também entender. Por favor, me diga quando eu falo muito rápido. Levante a mão, eu vou devagarando. Eu não falo português. Bom, vamos. Let me start with some comments on Berlin. I've brought you 3 maps of Berlin, 2 prepared by my wonderful colleague, Robert Fief, and 1 copied from the police department website. What you see is child poverty rates, the square meter per person in the household as indicator of housing conditions, so the size of the house that people have, and the rate of serious violent crime per 100,000 residents. Light is better, dark is worse. And as you see, the overall is darker or dark in often the same parts of the city. There's a little exemption with a yellow angle. That's because there's a soccer stadium, and that affects the crime rate. So, the peculiarity of Berlin, in comparison to many cities in the world, is remarkable, as it resists the transformation of urban inequalities and their increase rather than decrease, even though public policies are in place to reduce advanced marginalization. There's no issue of access to basic infrastructure like sanitation, road quality, electricity for urban citizens in terms of its spatial distribution. But even when the maps show you an unequal city, I'm going to take you to that place because it's a case that where infrastructural differences of public investment do not determine disadvantage. Now, of course, as Eduardo Marques has pointed out for Sao Paulo, or Alvarez and Ruiz Tagle, for Santiago de Chile, the lives of the poor in Latin America are no longer outside formal modern institutional frameworks as well. Alvarez and Ruiz argued that the absence and abandonment by institutions is a concrete consequence of stigmatization in the Santiago de Chile case, but that cannot be said about Berlin either. There are more square meters of playgrounds per capita in the poorer districts than in the affluent areas. And also the access to shopping or green space does not create sites of disadvantage. The inner city neighborhoods with the most problems and negative news descriptions are also the areas with the most hipster bars and the highest concentrations of Airbnb, and most likely the neighborhoods that if you've been to Berlin, you have visited. When we've calculated segregation indices for Berlin, done by my colleague Robert Fief, we found that the segregation of child poverty, but also, he found segregation of child poverty. But we also found that the access to public transportation, measured by the closest stop to access a bus, tram, or metro, did not differ. This is why we discuss this as segregation in a well-connected city. So, that all looks well. And yet, it's not. We cannot blame the distribution of public services in the city to explain spatial concentration of disadvantage. And yet, position and location matter for educational outcomes, for example, or for the chance to become a victim of a street robbery. I now need to tell you that 165 people died of violence in the city in 2023, and that as far as we know, none of them was killed by the police, just to sort of put that in perspective. But in a larger picture, one may wonder, why the worry? Well, we worry because the question should not be how high is the risk to get killed by police or otherwise. The question is how urban citizenship includes the principle of urban justice, that the city is a city for all. So if one cannot point to the unequal provision of state care and control in lower quality, as Torres and colleagues have diagnosed for Sao Paulo already 20 years ago, or if one cannot rely on arguments like spolative conditions that we can now read about thanks to the translation of Kororic's work, if one cannot even adopt the thesis of the truly disadvantaged of Julius Wilson in the United States because we have no food deserts and no mismatches of jobs and people, or the advanced marginality of Louis Wacan, who in his work found an institutional neglect from the state in Chicago or the banlieues of Paris. We can't use all of that, and yet still, the city produces unequal outcomes depending on position and location. There must be something at stake with what happens in the relation between institutional agents and urban citizens. Now, a common and dominant answer, also one that's extensively discussed in the literature on street-level bureaucracy, is that the uptake of social programs, the successful roads in education, the access to healthcare, for example, depend on various forms of literacy. You know this argument too well, because such questions are extensively discussed in the Brazilian context too. What I observe in the context of Berlin is an approach to this issue that works with a notion of deficiency on the side of the residents. If only they would participate better. I suspect, however, that much more needs to be done in understanding the institutional agents working in relations with urban citizens, and this is what I will focus on in the rest of my talk. So here's my overall concern. What could we say about the workings of institutions, how they contribute to durable inequalities, and what is the spatial dimension of such workings? In a city where urban fragmentation and residential segregation indices do not provide substantial frames of explanation. And on the surface, we see a well-infrastructured city with a state that cares and controls. I would like to suggest an explanation to the Berlin context with the following core ideas. My core argument is that both the police force and the public school system, the two cases that I'm going to look at, have an institutional logic in which a sense of normal is produced that conflates what is situational normal in some areas of the city with a normative normality. To make this clearer, let me briefly mention some of the theoretical ideas that inform this thinking. First, it is important to see that normality is always fluid and transforming as a relational construct, that it depends on time and place, and that it requires some form of habituation or habits, things that we do in routine because we have repeated them so often. Mistal writes that normality is based either on our perception of the regularity of people's behavior, the factual dimension, or the classification of actions as a rule of norm-following behavior, the normative dimension. For Richard Jenkins, the idea of normality is under-theorized in sociological work, and he suggests that that may be because even though it's very obvious and omnipresent, collectively shared, people have always had a reasonable idea of difference between the usual and the unusual, and that's exactly because we are so used to making those distinctions that the concept has not received a central theoretical place. Historically, scholars like Richard Jenkins, Barbara Mistal, and Sophie Freud trace our understandings of normality or normalcy back to attempts to create a natural science, right, in the sociology of Comte and Durkheim and their mates. So here's what we know, right? That's a picture of a normal distribution. And the thing with the normal distribution is that it's usually very good to be on the top. It's often also very good to be on the upper side, the right side of the model, and not so good to be below. So an equation of the statistical typical with the normative normal is lying around the corner and creates the deviance as the pathological. Jenkins writes, in the basic statistical model, and I quote that, normality is no more than the average. It can always potentially be improved upon, and deviance in the top of the tail of the normal distribution may be desirable. Such judgments of normality are relative to a structured sense of certain context. The logic of normality works effectively as boundary work, however, the logic of normality works effectively as boundary work when it draws boundaries without specifying a context. Let me give you two examples. It's normalized for you to do almost everything on WhatsApp. Whereas in Berlin, that's not normal at all. Berlin is not as digital as Sao Paulo. The use of Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp is much more restricted, especially in the public sector. The data protection principles that direct decisions on what we can use as means of communication, and, for example, that teachers can use as means of communication, are limited to phone numbers and email addresses. We cannot use WhatsApp groups to communicate with teachers and teachers not with us. We'll see later why that becomes relevant. Situational normality doesn't necessarily overlap with normative normality. That's an example which is situationally normal, but it's a long discussion whether it's also normative. But a normative order, according to Mistel, may prescribe a normality from within certain acts and certain people as excluded, and still ascribe a normality for them, by which she means, for example, it is normal for your toddler to throw itself on the floor of the supermarket and scream and yell for not getting its way. You may be ashamed, no? That make you feel ashamed, but it's normal behavior. It's not normal for your mother-in-law. So let us now take such basic ideas about normality to two cases of citizen-state relations. The research I will refer to was conducted in 2020 and 2021 in the pandemic. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in Germany, we saw a very homogenizing debate on how the pandemic affected people's life. I had an enormous urge to do empirical work, as I was quite convinced that some things were happening of which nobody thought enough from a sociological viewpoint. With the COVID-19 restrictions coming into place in the spring of 2020, the existing inequalities in German society were flattened by a public narrative of all being in the same boat. We were on the same storm, but certainly in very different boats. The dominant discourse of stay at home and protecting others by doing so was heavy and seemed to leave very little space for other voices. Rigorous measures were taken, although not at all as rigorous, of course, as in Brazil. We don't really like to revisit this period, do we? Mm-hmm. I don't. But I wanted to highlight three elements that we may forget easily. First, there was a sense of public policy panic. With Italy slightly ahead of Germany in the development of the pandemic, the images that we got on television of deaths, hospital patients having no beds, and other images that the German collective consciousness would never connect to their own society brought an immediacy of having to act immediately, heavily. The announcement of the lockdown came literally overnight. We spoke to social workers who recalled getting a call from their boss to close in a matter of hours, and schools heard on Friday afternoon that they were going to be closed on Monday. And there was no plan. This gives you a very simplified idea of the decrees that were brought to the level of the public, to the people that interest us today. So what happened was a decision that the Constitution allowed that in the sense of a health crisis, decisions that were being made on policy did not have to go through Parliament. So in Berlin, you have the mayor that is elected by the state parliament and 10 senators that are appointed by the mayor that then were ruling the city. And I brought you the graph so you can see that the elementary school teachers in the public school system, and that's where about 90% of the children in Berlin goes to, and the police officers who worked the grounds of the city, outside on the street, were on the very bottom of these things of how policy was transferred. And for the police, I need to quickly say one thing about its organization. We have two forms of police. The one is the Schutzpolizei, the other one is the Bereitschaftspolizei. The Schutzpolizei is the police that you call when you have a burglary at your house or that turns up when there's a fight in the street. The Bereitschaftspolizei is translated literally with readiness police. And these are organized in squads, and they're what in other countries are called riot police. The Germans don't call them riot police for all sorts of historical reasons, maybe. It's a bit different. My point here is just that these two different frames of policing is important because some of the empirical material comes from one and the rest comes from the other. And the point of this sheet is just that without parliamentary control, a lot of regulations were communicated down and had to somehow implement it. So, second point, the state interventions on both hands of the state, caring and controlling, were highly incremental and changed at a tremendous speed. You don't have to read this, but this is part of a list, a long list, of all the decrees that were put into place by the local state government of Berlin. The first decree that was decided, and up to the one in November, there was 19 revisions between June and November of only that one law. So this is a list that shows you that the usual workings of policy dissemination into the practices of street-level workers, like police officers or teachers, was taking a totally different speed, because usually it goes very slow. Both the Berlin police force and the public school system can be described as bureaucratic organizations with a lot of inertia. But the use of decrees as a policy and regulating tool in times of crisis, as was possible within the Constitution, policy changes came very fast, implemented in a constantly dynamic, rapidly changing context with an enormous degree of uncertainty. And as Mary Douglas writes, certainty is not an emotion, a mood, or a feeling of a person. It's an institution. Certainty is only possible because, she writes, doubt is blocked institutionally. So let us now look at the empirical work. In the next few minutes, I will present you some fragments of our analysis of qualitative interviews, focus groups and observations with Berlin police officers that show categorizations of normal citizens. How did officers construct categories and what did they see as normal? Now, of course, there's a growing literature on racism in police culture that theorizes racial profiling, racist police practices, and other forms of state violence. To this valuable work, our work adds that the understanding of institutional racism may benefit also from a perspective that focuses less on that part of police culture towards marginalized subjects, but more on the policing of dominant social groups, such as the white middle classes in Berlin. Second, I traced challenges of teachers in elementary schools in so-called deprived areas and middle-class areas in the city that were organizing education in what was a digital desert, the Berlin public education system. Schools are good sites to study whether challenges caused by the pandemic were met as organizational problems through categorical distinctions. So Leonie Krügener conducted the narrative interviews during and directly after the peak of the pandemic in 2020, and the police work was supported by various students from a seminar. Our analysis shows that the construction of normal citizens among police officers came up when we asked them to share experiences of how they policed the COVID-19 restrictions. Now, the use of the Constitution to announce these decrees was one of the reasons among many why it came to many demonstrations against the COVID-19 restrictions. These restrictions constituted a situationally not normal everyday working context for police officers. in which they were expected to effectively enforce new things every day. So they would tell us in the interviews about how every day there was a new email, there was a new message about new things that they had to police and other things that they had no longer to police. So one day, two people could not walk together in the street, the other way they could. One day you couldn't go to the playgrounds because they were closed, and then you could. This situation was flanked by the murder of George Floyd and the eviction of a left-wing housing project doing our fieldwork. And we have written about this, but I'm leaving this aside for now. The police practices on which the officers reflected in the 4 district offices and in the riot police squad that we investigated quite consistently consolidated the notion of normal. And these 2 fragments give you examples of that. We learned that these interactions, these are 2 quotes of police officers that talk about the demonstrations, where they say, well, they were partly people who came from the normal middle-class clientele. These were people, so they were taken by a bit of a surprise that they had to start policing people that they wouldn't necessarily have thought of as their public before the COVID. The COVID-19 protesters refused to keep distance and wear masks, resulting in active police actions to middle-class, predominantly white citizens. And you can see their surprise in these 2 quotes. The second part where the policing of normal people came up in the interviews was when normal people were doing normal things. There was a bit of a talk in the interviews about residents calling the police to denunciate their neighbors. Sometimes it was because there were tensions between youth in an area and people living in high-rise buildings and calling the police to tell these youth to not be there because you weren't allowed to gather in groups outside. So the long-term irritation about youth in their neighborhood, now finally they had a tool to call the cops. But it was also an example where one police officer talked about a neighborhood that is similar to the one in the picture, where someone had her daughter or son visiting from München, and München has a different license plate as Berlin. So she called the cops because you weren't supposed to have visitors at your house from another place. So she called the cops on her neighbors because she was having her daughter to come visit. So it is that this police officer refers to when he says he found it difficult to drive certain operations, where driving is, driving the car and taking the calls. The notion of normal appeared to reinforce the status quo of existing marginalizations, as I hope you can follow from these quotes. It hooked everyday constructions of normality from broader societal power structures into the local everyday policing categories that were embedded in the historic specificity, of course, of policing in Berlin. The categorization of normal citizens assumed whiteness, a middle-class family life, and a political position of not left. As I said, I can't go into everything, so I'm leaving that aside. The figure of the normal citizen thus served not to refer to what was average. It provided police work with a normative reference to categorize those on whose support and favor the police can and needs to rely on in normal times. The normal citizens are people with whom a mutual good relationship can exist, which in turn depends on structural conditions and the police organizational structure. The categorization of normal citizens plays into relationships between police and citizens and then becomes a mechanism that produces potentially unequal policing, as you can see in these examples. And then, we don't need to communicate with the implication of having to communicate with the normal people as not like an axe in the woods sort of suggests that this is a concern that one wouldn't have to have if one wasn't going to police the normal people. So our understanding of stigmatization of marginalized subjects through policing that is already out there in the literature can be strengthened by a focus on how normality rather than deviance is constructed. Police officers may speak the truth when they note that they suddenly had to police people who otherwise would never have received their attention. And they may be authentically now follow Portuguese, now follow English, and authentically surprised by the reactions they received. This truth, to end with Sarah Ahmed's observation, relies on certain distinctions, boundaries, and concepts that are assumed to be self-evident. Let me turn from here to the teachers. Unequal indication includes that children of parents with a certain habitus are likely to do well in school. There's a lot of literature on this. The Berlin school system is based on assumptions about social class and assumes a certain habitus. It's a habitus that supports the formal educational system and its meritocratic, metric, and competitive base. A system with values punctuality, endurance in boredom, rehearsal and reciting, task completion, and discipline. And all that following over independence. Homework, for example, is justified in lower grades with learning discipline, routine task completion, and responsibility towards hierarchically defined duty. There's quite some work on social class and education, for example, by Laureau, but often it shows that the right habitus of the parents will bring the children far. So we decided to focus on teachers and how they move between state agent narratives, society's normative expectations of normality, and the street-level situational normality. Inequalities may be reproduced because when organizational problems must be resolved, categories can be made and reinforced, an argument from Charles Tilly. For the teachers we interviewed, the emulation, also a concept of Charles Tilly, the taking over of normalizing categorizations from other contexts in their own context, contributed to the urban inequality impasse. But first, especially those in deprived areas, teachers in deprived areas, noted that the decrees that were sent to them had no relation to the lived reality, as these quotes show. Now, they had no idea under which conditions. Especially the situation with the tablets was interesting, because there were tablets given to schools that then had to be distributed to the teacher, and there were many examples in which that didn't work at all. I can tell you more details about that in the Q&A. Overall, teachers relied on mothers and an ideology of intensive mothering that included the transmission of those educational values that I just mentioned, routinized tasks, exercising control over the completion of these tasks in families. Now, in families where before COVID-19 parents didn't have to worry about existential needs, the homework and school attendance of children had been better before COVID-19 and continued to work well. The pressure teachers of such classrooms sometimes felt from parents was also big. So parents demanded more from the teachers than teachers were able to deliver during the pandemic. A strong belief in the necessity to stick to the daily time regime of school days was outstanding. All over the interviews we see that, or in many of the interviews we see that that was visible, that teachers tried to stick to the same daily regimes. In some families, it wasn't possible to speak to the children on the phone. So teachers would try to talk to the children on the phone and then had the message from the parents that the children were asleep. And one teacher described that she and her colleagues talked to the parents to make sure that next time the child would be awake in the morning and in a condition to speak to us. The teachers, independent of which school they worked at or what social class their students came from, all had an overall expectation that mothers would step in to do the best to take over the schooling at home. One teacher uploaded the week plans on Friday so that, and I quote, everybody could stick to it, and for the parents it was good too, because they could prepare all the things during the weekend, like print it off, and so I see that some people are recognizing what I say here. Parents, understood as mothers, who invested a lot of time and material resources, received strong recognition. So we have teachers that say, like, they bought like little furniture for the kids and stuff like that. In the context of the middle class school, where whether parents had unequal access to such resources was not a theme at all. So a teacher praised the absence of normality for the time. It freed up parents for children who had a good time, and it was gifted time. So the lockdown was talked about as gifted time, qualifying herself as a teacher. When she said that, however, by adding to that, so she talks about how it's a good time and it's a gifted time to spend time with your children. That's it. When everything is intact and everything is good, it was a great gift of time. So you see there's a normative construction there of what when good time is good time in what kind of families. Her qualification made clear that an intact family of two parents was the normative, and heterosexual parents, of course, was the normative normality over other forms of family life that were equally not good. She also praised the remarkable projects, canoe trips, walks in nature, excursions to a second home in the country, which gave children quality time and maintained that with the individual attention of mom. As the new language teacher at home, some students had learned faster than they would have done in school. Another teacher more directly made parents responsible for the children's performance, differentiating between cooperative and non-cooperative ones. She noted that some parents did not pick up the phone and an email can be easily pushed away when homework was not delivered. What am I supposed to do? I cannot go there simply. That's impossible. But I get incredible feedback from the cooperative parents. The self-evidence that the school was a responsibility of mothers and that the normality needed to preserve, the situational normality needed to preserve, was visible in that she expected her students to send voice messages of their reading aloud to grade them, as grading obviously had to be done. In the more affluent neighborhoods, teachers reported parents to be thankful not to lose touch, noted that it's important to give the children structure, and certain parents wouldn't manage to do that, which again reflected the ideology of intensive mothering. It's the parents. It's the parents. That makes all the difference. Teachers in school in the least affluent neighborhoods, however, didn't have the same expectations of parents, although they did assume that the parents made all the difference, if they had the capabilities to do so. Teachers at schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods started the lockdown, of course, under very different objective conditions. There was no email list with parents' addresses, nor were there other communication structures in place. They had students where nobody spoke German at home, there was no internet connection, or no digital device. Teachers reported about students who lived in a homeless shelter, a refugee center, and a safe house who changed schools frequently. They shared concerns about students with parents with mental illness.
Later, mais tarde.
Mais tarde.
Yes. Thank you.
And financial insecurities. So this is a quote again. When the parents have so little education that they do not know how to deal with emails, how are they supposed to help their children? At times, this teacher wished things to be different. And in the quote that you have on the slide there, she's talking about one of her students who was participating online in one of the sessions that she tried to do. It was so loud, where I thought they don't even have that many children. It should be important for them that the child is taking part in education right now. And why is it so loud there? The idea of Breus, of an unemancipated other, is in the other quote, where the teacher made sense of the problems to work with his students where they're not in school and difficult to reach, by referring to the traditional roles of a Muslim family. She contrasted this family with a sense of we, which included German families, but was not further specified. The migrant mothers were constructed as lesser skilled mothers who live in ways that we cannot imagine, that live in other worlds, and who do not know any different. Stigmatization, Tyler and Slater write, is never a static or natural phenomenon, but rather a consequential and injurious form of action through collective representation fastened on peoples and places. It is, in other words, always an emulation. Now, before you think that everything was a mess, let me pay a brief tribute to the heroines in the discriminationary space that we also found, but also because what Maurice has said, the risk of putting too much focus on the institutional logic is that any agency tends to disappear. So here's two quotes of teachers that did things that they were not allowed to do. Like I said to you in the beginning, using WhatsApp is not something that is situational normal, but it's actually forbidden for elementary school teachers, or was during the pandemic. So she couldn't enter the WhatsApp group that the parents had, and then eventually decided to do it anyway. And another one made YouTube videos for her class to participate or to watch, and that was also problematic because of the data protection regulations. And she then just continued producing them, and not producing them as a job, but producing them as a private person, and parents just happened to learn about these videos. So that is to sort of balance the idea that teachers were not trying to do things in a productive or sincere way. And it also brings me then to my summary. We've seen glimpses of our empirical material that shows that, first, the COVID-19 restrictions constituted a very not normal everyday working context, which is obvious. Police officers defined new subjects in the pandemic, often as normal persons, which had to be treated differently than subjects of policing placed outside of the category of normality, at the intersection of class, race, and political positions, their usual suspects, so to say. Officers hooked larger everyday constructions of normality into local everyday policing strategies and collated situational and normative normalcy. And it's important that we did group interviews, because it's in the group interviews that they do this, which is an indication that it isn't just like in some of the street level bureaucracy literature, a measure of how does the individual differentiate between the deserving and the deserving and the undeserving, but it was actually a construction of normality that they shared. Teachers used normality to explain the failure of education for certain families through the absence of an intensive parenting ideology in these families as the core problem. Their certainty that routine work had to be done as normal created a possible mismatch with the situation of many of the children. So our teachers and police officers provide a case of a common practice of often non-reflexive acts of categorization. We all perceive categories at some point as given. They naturalize our social orders, and our acting upon categories reproduces them. This is what Bourdieu refers to, as you know, as the doxa. And I said, Bourdieu, that which is beyond question and which each agent tacitly accords by the mere fact of acting in accord with social conventions. I'm never sure if it makes sense to quote Bourdieu verbally. I mean, in this talk, I've just analyzed the normal as a taken for granted categorization in the sense of a doxa, appearing as an aside in conversations and working because of an imagined, shared, not reflective understanding of normality, which officers and teachers assumed that we as researchers also shared. Now, this may not at all be surprising. In its development from the Middle Ages onwards, policing has meant maintaining the public order to safeguard the interests taken from the moral concepts of the middle classes, as people like Lautmann, Loik, and Hunold have argued. Police work does historically affect social classes differently. And I'm also not by far the first to refer to this as dominant whiteness. Weiss notes that being viewed and treated as a normal subject is revealed as an inherited privilege that white bodies enjoy and that non-white bodies do not. But that said, I think these findings still serve to bring us back to the overall issue that, as I said in the beginning, that I wanted to explore more. So let me jump to those conclusions now. The cultural practices of the workings of institution contribute, I hope the material can convince you of that, to the durability of urban inequalities in a city where urban fragmentation and residential segregation do not provide substantial frames of explanation, and where on the surface we see a relatively strong caring and controlling state in all urban regions. The construction of urban citizenship boundaries along lines of what is a normal citizen contribute to an urban impasse of durable inequality. In short, from an infrastructural right to the city, it's still a very long way to go to the right to the city. as urban citizenship claims are confronted with an urban impasse that requires institutional willingness to reflect on the ways that things are always done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You ended before your time. You were perfect. And wow, thank you for a really interesting talk. I have some comments, but as usual, I will first open to the audience to see, or if they are warming up, I would like to raise some questions and issues. Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like to hear more from you about the methods. At the end, you were talking about group interviews, and it would be interesting to know more how you approach the field. Did you carry out the research after the pandemics, during the pandemics? How did you negotiate your entering door in those fields? And for me, it's really interesting the way you pose the questions, how to measure and discuss categorization and unequal outcomes, even in a place that is seen like very not unequal. So this is really interesting. And how we can combine the institutional logics and the agents. This is really interesting, because this is an interesting way of connecting the urban studies with the implementation studies somehow. So could you please elaborate more on the methods and how you are connecting these literatures? And am I talking too fast? Sorry. No. And the second big question for you is how we can frame the COVID-19 as a focus event, right? We are talking about a crisis that was unexpected. Nobody was thinking about this, and there is a literature on this, how we can think about this type of crisis as a way of changing agendas or not. So how we can think about continuities and discontinuities, how we can classify your findings. Are they new patterns of behavior? How they change the previous behaviors? You know, how could we draw a type of comparisons? You know, because sometimes I feel like you are telling us a story of replacement of. You are talking about new types of interaction between citizens and public actors, but you know, how we can think about how the COVID-19 changed or not this interaction between the situational normality and the normative one. Because the normative one, as you mentioned, is a doxa. It's a sticked issue, right? And for sure, you had a lot of decrees, and I love it, your sheet on all the decrees. But, you know, what is the leverage for changing? What is really sticky, and how we can we think about long-term effects? Are we now you are facing new types of normality construction, or we are for sure we cannot foresee the future, but you know how these different layers of normality are being integrated or not now, you know. If we are interested in patterns and long-term patterns. Sorry for being a little bit messy, but you gave me a lot of food for thought. And now we have questions from the audience. It's always like this. People are shy and then they talk. Edu, I think you have to use the mic because of the, sorry, I know you don't like it.
Thanks a lot for... Much better. Then I won't have my back hurt. Thanks a lot, Talia. This was really inspiring. I have a lot of maybe too many questions because they are kind of disorganized. But I was thinking about the several normals involved in the research, the normal family, the abnormal times, and how both institutions and street-level bureaucrats treat this. I didn't. You presented a lot about the how teachers reacted and educational workers reacted, but what about the institutions? How the institutions, not associated directly with the persons, but the educational institutions reacted? And what about the differences between the layers of bureaucrats? Because we know that street level bureaucrats are really important, but the managers of street level bureaucrats are really important also, because they are the ones that control a little bit the discretionarity of the street. And another, so this is a question. And the other one is the difference between the police and the educational workers, because not only because they do completely different things. Controlling is very different from educating, although educating is also controlling in a sense. But, for example, it's impossible to police people online. So the activity of policing, even during the pandemic, involved real policing, in a sense that people were there in the streets doing things, although the teachers could be only online. So, and what are the differences the differences from the media in which the crisis was faced, posed to these two communities?
Thank you. Okay, we have another one. Is it okay for you? Would you like to collect one more, or would you like to reply first? What do you feel like doing?
The more I have, the more chance that something gets lost.
So, is it okay for you to wait so you can reply to this, and then we will have a second round?
Okay. But you have to watch my time.
No, it's okay.
Because yeah, but you have to watch my time, because my replies can get very long. On the methods, so it was a pragmatic project. I always wanted to do something on street level bureaucrats, and it was a very long desire. And I had to teach a research class during the pandemic, so I was looking for things that the students could actually do, and the police worked because they worked, so we could go. Not all the students wanted that. There's other students who didn't want, because of the pandemic reasons, of course, who were not. And the school teachers it was a group of students, and they had various options. There was also the mental health department, there was the child protection services, but not all of that material generated enough data of social quality that you could actually do something with it. So we started with a very basic question in both cases. With the teachers, with Leonie, did all the work. She did all the work, some of it in the context of the seminar and some that she got paid for. And the same with the police officers. There was some of the work that they did as part of their seminar work, and some that they got reimbursed for, especially for typing the transcripts. So the basic question that we used for asking was, well, how did your work change? Like, what happened when the pandemic came and you had to, how did your work change? And that proved especially in the group interviews that we did in 4 districts, provided a very good way of entering a conversation about things that police officers don't like to talk about, which is categorizations, racism, especially in the context of then we were middle of the fieldwork when George Floyd was killed. So we talked with them about that, but we were never doing a project on racism in the police. So there's a level of evaluating that material, certainly from that perspective, that we haven't done yet. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question. How did we decide where to go? We had a survey on COVID, the consequences of COVID for life in the city, which was a huge survey project. And we did that in 4 neighborhoods where we had done surveys before the pandemic. So there we were generating data to compare the effect of the pandemic. So we went to the same 4 areas. For the schools, it didn't quite work. We had similar districts, but not quite the same. And for the 4 policing districts, there it worked very well. So it's 2 one is on the outskirts, one is in the inner city. Both are socioeconomically deprived. One is gentrified inner city, and one is outside wealthy. So we had this kind of 4 neighborhoods that we've also used in our statistical work. In terms of access, there is a bias in the police work because the police officers were asked by their sub-districting. So I went first with one of the students and interviewed the sub-district leading officers. And then we had official permission from the police authority. So we came in officially. And then they asked in their offices who wanted to participate in the group interviews. And we have no control over how they got selected. In my dream, I'll have enough time to involve material that we've now collected for a very different project with the police on body cams, where we did a lot of much more with Nina Margis, a lot of much more ethnographic work, and we were very free because we could move through police district offices in a very free way. And with this project, we couldn't do that yet. So my hunch would be that we could have had slightly different stories that were more boundary work than we got, that were much more clear in, because I certainly think that we've interviewed people who were carefully not saying things, which is why we decided to focus on the normal, because we don't have them say bad things about people. At the same time, I also think we got to be careful to assume that they would have done that if we had talked to them in a different way. And the interviews with the 3 LPD officers, that's the Landespolizei, I forgot what it's an abbreviation of. It's the management level, and that goes back to your question, is there a difference? There's a very clear difference between how the managers talked about the pandemic and the policing practices, and how the people that were on the ground outdoors and did that. I've kind of mixed it up in the presentation, so it's a good suggestion to maybe think about that again and see if there was a good way to do it. How can we frame COVID-19? I don't know the answer to that. I think your question is very important. Like, has it changed our agendas or not? I think it'd be really difficult to isolate the pandemic effect here, because we've had other changes in the German society that I think were going on at the same time. And I wouldn't be able to say what is the pandemic effect, but I could imagine that some of the protests and the way in which the state and the dominant media have framed this protest. There was a word that was used in Germany, which was COVID idiots. COVID idioten. And that was a word that was sometimes used to classify people who went on the street to protest against those restrictions, which were not at all comparable to the ones in Brazil. So most of the time, we have not been able to go out. We could always in some form go out, which is also an answer to why were the people outside, and it was always that possibility. But I think something qualitatively and quantitatively has changed in the discussion since big categories of people who went to demonstrate were called idiots by others. And I don't think that that was very productive. So I think there is a change in the situation that is also normative. But it remains an empirical question, what the level of that change is. In terms of education, there's been studies of the effects of school closures and so on. I think that has been for a lot of countries that show quite diverse results. First, there was a lot of suggestion that there was evidence of certain things happening, domestic violence and all of that, and then the discussion disappeared. Is that an answer to your question?
Yes.
And has it changed the citizen public relations? Let me give you one very brief example to illustrate that. There's a certain institution where you can apply for it's like head sphere, so it's a basic income kind of thing when you're out of jobs. It's not unemployment. It's something. It's like a basic. It's like the most basic thing, and it's a very complicated process to apply for that, and you have to go there. And they used to have lines outside where people would wait for a very long time before it was their turn. And they've turned to appointments only. And they have had security staff in front of their buildings that they didn't have in the same way. They had security, but not in the same way before the pandemic. And some of those things have not completely changed back. So I think that state institutions, if you would look at it very closely empirically, my hypothesis would be that they've become more closed, that it's even more difficult to get in than it was, even physically, than to get in. It took a long time for schools to allow parents back into the building. So that it's good if people don't wait in line in front of your institution, right? We know this from Javier's work, and it's good when people don't wait in the presence of other people, because they may talk to each other, and they may learn. And they may find out that there's another regulation that they can use. So it's very effective to push people online. So that is, I think, one of the changes that I do see. Edo, what about the institutions? I haven't studied that. I don't know. I'm tempted to do it if I need like 7 lives like a cat. So because I've just seen yesterday, when I was preparing the paper, I've just seen that they've opened, there was a special committee that was installed by the national government with one of the biggest epidemiological institutes and one particular he was a virologist, and they were deciding all those things. Or planning them, or advising the government. Of course, the government was deciding, sorry. But they were advising, and the records of their meetings have become public since May. And I've just learned that I've looked at it quickly and very superficially, and I've especially looked at what they talked about with children and education. And from what I've seen, there have been many conversations in which they did not know whether it made sense to close the schools. Full stop. I don't really know. I have to look at it more carefully. But it's interesting because the Netherlands and Sweden did not. The Netherlands did very briefly, and Sweden did not close at all. So someone would have to research the actual effects of what teachers did, and I can't go in all the details of that. But there is also teachers who lost children, who had no contact with them for the entire period. And there's also teachers who did nothing but sending the homework home, and if parents didn't come pick it up, children couldn't. So it would be interesting to see what the mechanisms have been to go for that closure and why that was. Because it was very obvious that it was going to work unequally to any sociologist, I think. The police and school difference. Yes. I thought it was interesting to put them in one presentation because of this idea that it's two things. But when I was then putting it together, I also felt that it was a bit imbalanced because the teachers used the normalization in a different way than the police officers, in the sense that I think with the teachers it's much clearer that what is normal was already there. It was the expectations of what mothers have to do and how homework has to be done, and also their attempt to stick to a situational normality by saying, well, they have to read aloud to me on their phone, so send me WhatsApp, phone messages, whatever, recordings, so I can grade them. I mean, why would you grade a 7-year-old to begin with, right? It's this kind of thing. So, and that's not with the police. With the police, it's much more about how can we flexibly survive all these things that they're dumping on us in a way that our work still makes sense. So even the normalities, and you're right, that there's more than one work there in different ways. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Just
No, it's too.
take a
Yeah,
seat.
that's it.
That is. Now, could you please come?
Oh gosh.
No, it's okay.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. And I'd like to know if the concept or the idea of new normal showed up in the research. Here in Brazil, it was one of the several normative normals that showed up to justify that people need to adapt to this new state of things as this crisis became more prolonged. Thank you.
Anybody else? So now you can enjoy your time. Only one question.
Yeah, thank you. That's another nice question. It was part of the public discourse. There was talk about the new normal. The talk completely disappeared when the pandemic was announced. I don't know. When the biggest change in Germany came when the second phase of the Ukrainian war started. Because when the Ukrainian refugees came, the entire idea we had before that was that you could only use public transportation or... See, now I'm on YouTube. Now I'm not sure this is actually completely true, but it's something like this. That you had to be vaccinated or wear a mask, or maybe you had to be vaccinated to use public transport. There was something with vaccination and public transportation. And that was completely abolished the moment thousands of refugees came, because they were not vaccinated. So this entire idea of, and I remember this very well because we had Ukrainian refugees at our house, that one of them had to get vaccinated because they were taking the train to another part of Germany, and I had to organize a way of getting him vaccinated to get him there. So it was over suddenly in that sense. And I think then the new normal became another new normal, which was the normal in which the city had to come to terms with the situation of the second phase of the Ukrainian war, or the Russian war in Ukraine. In terms of, was it a new state of things as the crisis became more prolonged? I think my huge irritation was, as a sociologist, with especially this rhetoric about, oh, this is the new normal, you can what was it again? You can be slower, you can cook, you can try new recipes and all these kind of things. And that was true for some people. The debate was homogenizing, as if that was the case for everybody. And sometimes news, that was also what you were asking Edu about the media, sometimes news agents would go to a family and show that there is a problem because she's a nurse and she has to go to work and she has no daycare. So there was some of that awareness, and the local state also made adjustments in terms of, there was the schools reopened for children of essential workers. They could go to school. There is one school, one teacher that we talked about that I didn't talk about in the presentation, where they managed to get her entire classroom classified as essential workers. So there were ways of doing this, and this is a middle class in school in a gentrified area. These kids had education during the pandemic. It's invisible because it wasn't supposed to be that way, but it proves that there's always the informal in the formal, right? That there was this. But afterwards, I was thinking about this when I was now that I'm in Sao Paulo a little bit, that I think if you live for those, which is also only a selection, but for those residents in Sao Paulo that live in this condominium thing, where you have this place where you can put, this is when I came there, my landlady said, and this is for this, and this is for this, and this is where, if you order pizza, this is where they deliver it. And I was like, okay. I was going to eat Brazilian food, but apparently I also have to order pizza. So but that was already there. I don't think that thing got there since the pandemic, right?
Yeah,
It was there. So it seems that this situation for that kind of life was easier to adopt to a pandemic situation because, well, in my condominium, it feels like a pandemic. Like you never see anybody. You know, it's very sort of non-sociable. So I've been thinking about this a lot. And of course, many of the Berlin neighborhoods do not work like that at all. And the high-rises, interestingly enough, I don't know the extent of this, but we have a construction in the high-rises. We have one elevator for the entire floor. And if you have more elevators in buildings, you actually don't have a big building. You have several buildings in one construction, but it's several buildings. And I've been thinking about this a lot as well, how that affects how people interact, how they link to their neighbors. And I think we need to look at that before we can answer the question if there's definitely several normative normals, and if they have extended into a new state of things. I think it depends a lot on those practices before.
So, thank you very much for this great discussion, Talia. It was really nice.
Good.
Thank you. Jana, yeah, you can.
It feels like you went fast.
Yes, 1 hour and 20 minutes.
That's good.
Yeah, it was nice.